I have sat on this bench long enough, watching thousands of defendants walk through those heavy courtroom doors to spot a liar the second they cross the threshold. But what made this morning's case different wasn't just the deceit. It was the sheer, unadulterated arrogance baked into every movement, every step he took. His name was Marcus Thorne, 32 years old. When he walked in, he didn't carry the demeanor of a man facing the judgment of the law. He strode in with the posture of someone who believed he was the smartest person in the room. He slid into the defendant's chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and flashed a half smirk dripping with sarcasm. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't bothered. He was utterly convinced that the law was just a rug he could easily wipe his shoes on. Across the room, standing quietly by the plaintiff's podium, was Mrs. Eleanor Higgins. She was 68 years old, a widow with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing a knitted cardigan that was fraying at the cuffs. She stood there, her spine forced straight, but her hands were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were entirely white from the tension and helplessness. She had used every ounce of her goodwill, and the only asset her late husband had left her a small backyard cottage to rent to Marcus. That rent was her lifeline, the only way she could afford her monthly heart medication and basic groceries. The case file lay open on my desk. 8 months. 8 agonizing months Marcus Thorne had lived there without paying a single dime in rent. And he didn't just stop at stealing her income. When he finally vacated, he left behind a war zone. Walls punched full of holes, scorched carpets, and a shattered sliding glass door. The total in unpaid rent and damages amounted to $14,000. To the wealthy and entitled, that number might just be the cost of a luxury vacation, but to a lonely, elderly woman, it was an absolute fortune. It was her survival. When I asked Marcus to explain the massive debt, he didn't even bother to stand up straight. He tilted his chin up, looked directly at the bench, and spoke with a level of condescension that was hard to believe. "Your Honor, I don't owe that woman a single cent. That cottage was an absolute dump from day one. The pipes were leaking, and the heater was broken long before I moved in. I had to suffer living in those squalid conditions. Any damages she's whining about were just rotting infrastructure finally giving out. She's just a scammer trying to extort me." The entire courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. At the plaintiff's table, Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear of pure frustration and exhaustion escaping her lashes. She had scrubbed that cottage spotless before handing him the keys. She knew it. I knew it. But Marcus Thorne believed that because she was a frail old woman without an expensive lawyer, he could weave a web of lies and walk away clean. He looked at me, his arrogant smirk still firmly in place, waiting for me to bang my gavel and dismiss the case for a lack of evidence. He thought a slick-talking young man could easily crush the desperate plea of an old widow, but he was dead wrong. He had no idea that resting right beneath my paperwork was something he never saw coming, something that was about to rip his smug mask to absolute shreds. I slowly took off my glasses, closed the file, and looked him dead in the eye. His little game was over. Marcus Thorne didn't just stop at his initial denial. He began to build a masterpiece of fabrication. As I sat back, watching him through the top of my glasses, I noticed the way he shifted his weight. He wasn't retreating. Instead, he leaned forward, encroaching on the personal space of the court as if his physical presence could somehow make his lies more substantial. "Your Honor," he continued, his voice dropping into a tone of fake sincerity that made my skin crawl, "I actually did Mrs. Higgins a favor by staying as long as I did. I spent my own money fixing her leaky faucets and patching up the drywall that was crumbling like crackers. If anything, she should be paying me for the consulting work I did on her property." I looked over at Eleanor. The contrast was heartbreaking. While Marcus was expansive, taking up as much air as possible, Eleanor seemed to be shrinking. Her shoulders were hunched, and she was staring at the floor, her bottom lip trembling. This is the tale of two bodies I see so often in this room. On one side, you have the predator calculated, loud, and physically aggressive. On the other, the prey paralyzed by the shock that someone could be so boldly, publicly dishonest. Eleanor didn't have the verbal weapons to fight back. She didn't know how to interrupt a man who spoke with the confidence of a king while holding the heart of a thief. I leaned forward and tapped my pen on the mahogany bench. "Mr. Thorne," I interrupted, cutting through his rehearsed monologue like a cold blade. "Let's talk about the shattered glass door. You claim it was rotting infrastructure. Glass doesn't rot, Mr. Thorne. It shatters under impact. How do you explain a 3-ply tempered glass door turning into 1,000 pieces?" Marcus didn't blink. His eyes remained cold, fixed on mine. This is what I call the sociopathic gaze, the ability to look someone in the eye and lie without the pupils dilating or the voice cracking. "A bird, Your Honor," he said with a straight face. A large crow must have hit it while I was at work. I came home, saw the mess, and cleaned it up out of the goodness of my heart. Mrs. Higgins is just looking for a payday because she knows my family has a successful construction business. At that moment, Eleanor made a small, choked sound. It wasn't a word. It was a gasp of pure, unadulterated pain. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes brimming with a mix of fear and disbelief. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. She was drowning in his narrative, and she knew that if I believed him, she would lose everything. Her home, her dignity, her medicine, all gone because a 32-year-old man decided she was an easy target. I watched Marcus's reaction to her distress. He didn't look at her with guilt. He looked at her with annoyance. He checked his gold watch, exhaling a long, dramatic sigh, as if this elderly woman's life or death struggle was a minor inconvenience to his afternoon schedule. He believed he had won. He believed that because there were no witnesses inside that cottage during his 8-month reign of terror, it was his word against hers. And in his mind, his word was gold, and hers was trash. He was so comfortable in his arrogance that he failed to notice me reaching for the remote control on my desk. He didn't see the technician in the booth nodding at me. Marcus Thorne was about to learn that while he was busy fixing faucets and cleaning up glass, someone else had been paying very close attention. The silence in the courtroom was about to be broken by a voice he couldn't talk over. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low, calm register, the kind of calm that usually precedes a hurricane. "I want to give you one last opportunity to be an honest man. You've sat here and told me, under oath, that you were a model tenant. You've told me that birds are responsible for shattered glass and that rotting wood is responsible for holes in the drywall that perfectly match the size of a human fist. Is that your final story?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He actually let out a short, dry laugh, the kind of sound a man makes when he thinks he's playing a game with someone beneath his intellectual level. He adjusted his silk tie, his fingers steady, displaying a level of pathological confidence that usually takes years of elite entitlement to perfect. "Your Honor, it's not a story. It's the truth. I'm a busy man. I manage multi-million-dollar contracts. I don't have time to punch holes in walls or argue with an elderly woman over a few cracked tiles. She's confused, or perhaps she's just greedy." I watched his eyes. In physiognomy, we look for the superiority. Blink, a slow, deliberate closing of the eyelids that signals a person feels they have successfully dominated the conversation. Marcus did it twice. He thought he had closed the book. He thought Eleanor was just a footnote in his successful life. "Well, Mr. Thorne," I leaned forward, the leather of my chair creaking in the sudden expectant silence of the room. "It's a funny thing about greedy elderly women. Sometimes they are much smarter than the men who try to rob them. You see, Eleanor's grandson works in home security, and because Eleanor was living alone, he didn't just give her a hug for Christmas last year, he gave her a gift that keeps on giving." I saw it then, the first micro-expression of doubt, a tiny twitch at the corner of Marcus's left eye. The smirk didn't disappear, but it froze. It became a mask that no longer fit the face underneath. "Technician, play Exhibit B," I commanded. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly, and the large monitor mounted on the wall hummed to life. Marcus turned his head, his posture still rigid, still trying to project the image of an innocent man being inconvenienced. But as the first grainy, high-definition frame appeared on the screen, the air left his lungs in a visible shudder. The video wasn't from a neighbor's house. It wasn't a maybe or a could be. It was a Ring camera Eleanor's grandson had hidden inside a decorative birdhouse on the porch, pointed directly through the sliding glass door into the living area, a camera Marcus never noticed because he was too busy looking down at everyone else to ever look up. The date on the screen read, October 14th, 2:14 a.m. On the screen, a very different Marcus Thorne appeared. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a tank top, stumbling, clutching a bottle of expensive bourbon. The busy executive was throwing a tantrum. We watched in horrific, high-definition silence as Marcus picked up a heavy wooden chair and swung it with all his might, not at a bird, but directly into the center of the sliding glass door. The sound of the glass exploding filled the courtroom speakers, a violent, crystalline crash that made Eleanor flinch all over again. But the video didn't stop there. The camera captured Marcus looking at the wreckage, laughing, and then deliberately punching his fist through the drywall next to the light switch because he couldn't find the toggle. He wasn't fixing the house. He was dismantling it with the gleeful spite of a man who thought he would never have to pay the bill. I pressed the remote. The screen froze on a close-up of Marcus's face, red-veined, angry, and undeniably guilty. I turned back to the Marcus Thorne sitting in my courtroom. The sociopathic gaze was gone. His face had turned a sickly shade of gray, the color of wet ash. His hands, which had been so steady moments ago, were now tucked tightly under his thighs to hide the shaking. "Now, Mr. Thorne," I whispered into the silence. "Tell me again about the crow." The silence that followed the video was heavier than any shout. It was the sound of a man's reputation disintegrating in real time. I didn't look at the monitor anymore. I kept my eyes locked on Marcus Thorne. The sociopathic gaze he had walked in with had been replaced by something much more common, the panicked blinking of a trapped animal. He was no longer the busy executive managing multi-million-dollar contracts. He was just a small, violent man who had been caught red-handed. His attorney, a man who had likely been paid a handsome retainer to defend the indefensible, didn't even look at his client. He stared straight ahead at the mahogany bench, his hands folded, signaling a silent withdrawal. He knew what I knew, that once the thunderbolt of high-definition truth hits the floor, there is no room left for legal maneuvering. Marcus finally found his voice, but it was thin, cracking like the very glass he had shattered. "Your Honor, that was a very stressful period. My family's firm was under a massive audit. I had a few drinks. I didn't mean to. It wasn't a personal attack on Mrs. Higgins. It was just an outlet for the pressure I was under." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the desk. "Pressure, Mr. Thorne? You think the pressure of an audit justifies the destruction of a 6-8-year-old woman's safety? You didn't mean to swing a chair? You didn't mean to punch a hole in the wall? Your outlet for stress was to terrorize a widow who trusted you with her only source of income. That's not stress, Mr. Thorne. That is a profound, sickening lack of character." I turned my attention to Eleanor. For the first time since the hearing began, she had stopped staring at the floor. She was looking at Marcus, not with anger, but with a quiet, dignified sorrow. The predator had been stripped of his fangs, and the prey was finally breathing again. I saw her shoulders drop, the tension of 8 months of gaslighting finally leaving her body. This is the moment I live for on this bench, the moment where the lie is surgically removed, and the truth is allowed to fill the room. "You sat there 3 minutes ago," I continued, my voice echoing off the courtroom walls, "and called this woman a scammer. You told me she was greedy and confused. You were willing to let her go into her twilight years without her medicine, without her security, just so you could keep your deposit and your pride. You didn't just break a door, Marcus. You tried to break a human being." Marcus tried to adjust his tie again, but his fingers were trembling so violently he couldn't grasp the silk. The superiority blink was gone. He looked at the gallery, perhaps searching for someone to save him, but even the air in the room seemed to have turned against him. He was alone in a room full of people who now knew exactly who he was when the lights were down and the bourbon was flowing. I reached for my pen and began to write. The financial accounting was about to begin, but the moral accounting was already finished. Marcus Thorne had walked in believing he was untouchable. He was about to find out that in this courtroom, the weight of the truth is the only thing that never shifts. The monitor went dark, but the image of Marcus Thorne swinging that chair remained burned into the collective consciousness of the courtroom. I picked up the yellow legal pad where Eleanor had meticulously listed her losses. In this room, we don't just deal in emotions. We deal in cold, hard math. And Marcus's math was about to be corrected by a very expensive reality. "Mr. Thorne," I began, my voice clicking like a metronome in the silence. "You mentioned earlier that you provided consulting services to Mrs. Higgins. You claimed you patched drywall and fixed faucets. Let's look at the receipts for your work." I held up a grainy photo of a kitchen sink. "This faucet is held together with electrical tape and a prayer. Is this the multi-million-dollar expertise you were talking about? Or is this just another layer of the filth you left behind in a home that wasn't yours?" Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw hitched a classic physiological sign of speech blockage. When the brain knows the tongue has no valid defense, the muscles of the throat constrict. He looked like he was choking on his own arrogance. He managed to squeak out, I intended to have my crew finish the work, but she filed the eviction notice too early." "No, Mr. Thorne," I barked, slamming the file shut. She filed the notice because you hadn't paid her in 8 months. You treated this woman like a line of credit that didn't require repayment. You sat in that cottage, consuming her electricity, her water, and her peace of mind, while you were out managing contracts and buying bourbon that costs more than her monthly mortgage. You aren't a consultant. You're a squatter with a silver spoon. I looked at the specific line item for the $14,000, $8,000 in back rent, $6,000 in professional restoration. In my 30 years on the bench, I've noticed that people like Marcus don't care about the people they hurt. They only care about the digits in their bank account. To him, Eleanor wasn't a human being. She was a legal inconvenience. I watched his hands. They were no longer tucked under his thighs. They were gripped so tightly on the edge of the table that his cuticles were bleeding. He was looking at his attorney, begging for a lifeline, but the attorney was busy looking at the exit sign. This is the collapse of the entitled, when the person who has always been protected by a name or a firm realizes that in this room, the only thing that protects you is the truth. Mrs. Higgins, I said, turning my gaze to the widow. She looked 10 years younger now that the burden of proof had shifted. He claims he did work for you. Did you ever ask for his help? Eleanor stood up, her voice finally steady. No, Your Honor. Every time something broke, I offered to call a professional. He told me he'd handle it. He told me his people would take care of it. He used it as an excuse to withhold the rent. I trusted him because he reminded me of my own son. I thought he was just a busy young man having a hard time. I didn't know he was. I didn't know he was enjoying the destruction. The word enjoying hung in the air like a ghost. That was the insight. The realization that Marcus Thorne didn't just break things. He felt a sense of power in breaking things that belonged to someone who couldn't fight back. I turned back to Marcus. The judgment was ready. I could feel the weight of the gavel in my hand, but I wasn't done with him yet. He needed to feel the full weight of the moral debt he had incurred. Marcus Thorne was cornered, and like any predator stripped of its camouflage, he began to scramble. He realized that the executive mask was no longer working, so he reached for his last remaining weapon, his checkbook. He cleared his throat, trying to regain a shred of that lost composure, though the sweat beading on his upper lip told a different story. All right, Your Honor, he said, his voice regaining a hint of that oily, transactional tone. Clearly, there was a misunderstanding regarding the glass. I'm a reasonable man. I'll write a check for the $14,000 right now. Let's just put this behind us so I can get back to my meetings. It's a drop in the bucket for me anyway. The courtroom went cold. It was the ultimate insult, the belief that a pile of cash could erase the months of psychological warfare he had waged against a defenseless woman. I leaned so far over the bench that Marcus instinctively flinched back. A drop in the bucket, Mr. Thorne? I whispered, the silence in the room so sharp it could cut. You think you can walk into my courtroom, lie to my face for 45 minutes, slander an innocent woman's character, and then simply buy your way out of the consequences because you have a bucket full of money? I looked at his hands again. In the study of behavioral psychology, we look for displacement behaviors. Marcus was obsessively straightening the papers on his desk, his fingers twitching. He couldn't look at me, and he certainly couldn't look at Eleanor. He was trying to minimize the situation, to turn a moral failing into a simple business transaction. But justice isn't a commodity you buy at a discount. You don't get it, do you? I continued, my voice rising like a gathering storm. The $14,000 isn't a settlement, it's the floor. It's the bare minimum required to fix the physical damage you caused with your drunken, entitled tantrums. But we haven't even begun to talk about the moral interest you owe this woman. You sat here and called her a scammer. You tried to ruin her reputation in a public record. You didn't just withhold rent. You withheld her peace of mind. You let her wonder if she was going to be homeless while you were out managing contracts. Eleanor was watching him now, her face no longer filled with sorrow, but with a quiet, burning strength. She saw him for exactly what he was, a small man hiding behind a big bank account. She didn't want his settlement. She wanted the truth to be the final word. Mr. Thorne, you mentioned you have meetings, I said, a dark smile playing at the corners of my mouth. Well, cancel them, because you aren't leaving this building until I've finished auditing your character, and I can tell you right now, your account is significantly overdrawn. Marcus's attorney whispered something in his ear, likely telling him to shut up before I doubled the damages. Marcus bit his lip, a tiny drop of blood appearing the leak of reality. His world was shrinking to the size of a witness stand, and for the first time in his life, his money was absolutely useless. Marcus Thorne sat in a state of total structural failure. His expensive suit, which he had worn as a suit of armor to intimidate a widow, now looked like a costume that was 2 sizes too big. I watched the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, not with the strength of a leader, but with the desperation of someone trying to keep the floor from swallowing him whole. He looked at the $14,000 check he had just tried to use as a get-out-of-jail-free card, and for the first time, he realized that in this room, his currency was worthless. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice echoing with the cold finality of a closing door. "You thought this was a negotiation. You thought you could treat this courtroom like a boardroom where you could buy a settlement and walk away with your ego intact. But justice doesn't have a price tag. You don't just pay for the glass you broke, you pay for the soul you tried to crush." I turned my attention to the psychological wreckage he had left behind. In physiognomy, we often see the collapse of the jaw, where the muscles of the face lose their tension because the lies can no longer hold them up. Marcus's face was sagging. The titan of construction was revealed to be a toddler in a tie. "You sat there and looked at this woman," I gestured toward Eleanor, "and you didn't see a human being. You saw an easy mark. You saw a 6, 8-year-old widow and thought, she's too old to fight, too poor to hire a lawyer, and too tired to stand up to me. That is the definition of a bully, Mr. Thorne. And if there is one thing I cannot tolerate in my presence, it is a bully who hides behind a family name." Eleanor was no longer leaning away. She was leaning forward, her eyes bright with a clarity I hadn't seen when she first walked in. She wasn't just watching a legal proceeding. She was watching the exorcism of her fear. The man who had haunted her dreams for 8 months, the man who had made her feel small in her own home, was now the smallest thing in the room. "I'm doubling the statutory damages," I announced, and the sound of my voice caused Marcus to jump as if he'd been struck. "You owe the back rent. You owe for every square inch of drywall. You owe for the glass. But you also owe for the tort of outrage. You intentionally inflicted emotional distress on a vulnerable senior. You didn't just break her house. You tried to break her spirit so she would be too afraid to come after you. Well, Mr. Thorne, she wasn't afraid. She was patient. And patience, when backed by the truth, is the most dangerous thing in the world for a man like you." Marcus's attorney finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Your Honor, my client accepts the financial responsibility. He doesn't have a choice but to accept it," I thundered, cutting him off. "But responsibility isn't just a check, it's an admission. Mr. Thorne, look at Mrs. Higgins. Look at her." Marcus slowly turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his pride bleeding out on the courtroom floor. He couldn't sustain the gaze for more than a second before his head dropped to his chest. The superiority blink was dead. The sociopathic gaze was gone. All that was left was the slump of the defeated. I picked up my gavel. The final blow was coming, not just for his bank account, but for the very foundation of the untouchable life he had built on the backs of people like Eleanor. The courtroom was as silent as a cathedral. Marcus Thorne remained slumped in his chair, his head bowed so low, his chin touched his expensive silk tie. The titan of industry had finally been reduced to his true form, a man who had tried to build his happiness on the suffering of those he deemed lesser. I looked at him, and then I looked at the gavel in my hand. This wasn't just about wood hitting wood. It was the sound of a moral universe correcting itself. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice resonating with a finality that brooked no further argument. "You came into this room believing that your status, your family name, and your bank account made you untouchable. You looked at Eleanor Higgins, a woman who has worked harder in a single week than you have in your entire privileged life, and you saw a victim. But today, the law looked at you and saw a predator." I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "I am awarding judgment to the plaintiff, Mrs. Eleanor Higgins, in the full amount of $14,000 for rent and physical damages. Furthermore, I am awarding an additional $10,000 in punitive damages for the intentional infliction of emotional distress and the blatant attempt to mislead this court. That is a total of $24,000, payable immediately." Marcus didn't move. He didn't protest. The hidden video proof had stripped him of the ability to even pretend he was innocent. He was a man who had lost his most valuable asset, his mask. I turned to Eleanor. The transformation in her was the true victory of the day. The physiognomy of fear, the tight jaw, the clouded eyes, the trembling hands had vanished. In its place was a woman who stood tall, her face radiant with the quiet dignity of someone who had been vindicated. She didn't look at Marcus with spite. She looked at him with the pity one feels for a hollow vessel. Mrs. Higgins, I softened my tone. You are a woman of immense grace. You gave this man your trust, and he betrayed it. But today, you walk out of here not as a victim of a bad tenant, but as a victor over a bully. Use this money to fix your home, buy your medicine, and most importantly, buy back the peace of mind that he tried to steal. You earned it. Eleanor gave a small, respectful nod, a single tear of relief finally rolling down her cheek. She wasn't just getting her money back, she was getting her life back. I turned back to Marcus, my eyes turning back to ice. As for you, Mr. Thorne, if I ever see you in my courtroom again for so much as a parking ticket, I will ensure that every licensing board in this state hears about your consulting methods and your penchant for Crow-related property damage. You are dismissed. Bang. The sound of the gavel echoed like a lightning strike. As Marcus was led out by his attorney, his shoulders hunched and his eyes fixed on the floor, the gallery remained still. They had witnessed the collapse of privilege in real time. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with the precision of a surgeon. I watched Eleanor walk out of the room, her step light and her head held high. The entitled tenant had learned a lesson he would never forget, but the widow had learned something even more important, that no matter how loud the lie, the truth always has the final word. Case closed.